Okay, well, we get ready to get started here. I want to welcome everybody. We got, wow, good. We got 21 people here. So what I'd like to start with, I'm going to try this one more time. I'm going to just borrow the screen for a second. And if a lot of people remember the Pledge of Allegiance by Red Skelton, I'm going to try to play that, see everybody get a chance to see that one and actually hear it.
Do I need to unshare my screen?
Let's see what happens if I can get this thing going. Can everybody see that?
No.
Do they see Red Skelton?
No.
Okay,
Right.
why don't you, yeah,
Let me get out of there.
okay.
Hang on. Give me a second.
Let me know if you can see it when you're done.
Okay.
I just got it. Yeah.
Okay, you can see Red Skelton?
Yes.
Okay, like I say, if you remember, I remember seeing this live, but this is something really good. I think we need to hear it. It's wild.
You need to unmute
Turn the
him.
volume up on the video.
How's that?
Can't hear it.
No.
No.
Anybody hear it?
No.
No.
Can everybody hear that or no?
No.
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 Okay, I'll go pass out of that one again. I apologize. Go back to the okay, George, why don't you go and bring your screen back up again then?
Okay.
Because it's blasting me right out of my room. Okay, just a quick thing before you get started is just remind everybody, because it is a new year for the membership. And like I say, you can contact me or I can email to you, but also on our website, we have where you could sign up, get a membership card there, or you can actually sign up through the website. Same with the sponsorship. Like I said, because we're not having our field trips, our funds are getting a little low. And what I'll do, I'll save at the end for Steve, you at the end if you want to talk about your speaker tomorrow night. And so what I'd like to do is just, like I said, what I'm going to do, I'll mute everybody. Then George, I'll unmute you after the introduction. And then, like I said, if you have any questions, look over in the chat, write the things down. And then at the end, I'll give the questions to George. Then also after that, if you have a question, unmute yourself, ask the question, then mute yourself. So like I said, tonight's talk is going to be about raid, murder, and retribution, the destruction of the Weldon Railroad, December 1864. If anybody's gone down 95 between Richmond and heading for North Carolina, you always see the historical marker about the battle that happened there. And I went there many times and never kept driving by, never had time to stop. But I'd like to introduce George, our speaker tonight. Like he's a historian. He's the executive director of the Erie County Historical Society, and he's published many articles on the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. And he also has a book on the flagship Niagara from the War of 1812. I believe also, George, you were busy helping get that thing refurbished and everything. What I'd like to do is, and it has a long biography. What I'd like to do, I'm going to just mute everybody. And then what I'll do, I'll give this back over to you, George. And see if I can mute everybody. My machine's acting crazy. I apologize for that.
I said, I clicked on dial in internet.
Okay, I've got everybody muted except George. You're good to go. You should be. You can unmute yourself and start talking.
Okay. It looks like I am unmuted. Well, thanks for having me. This is a topic which I stumbled across. I've been working on a book on the 83rd Pennsylvania off and on for more than 10 years. And as I was looking at some letters and whatnot, I realized about this raid. And it's something that I'd really never stumbled across before. And I started digging and digging, and the more I dug, the more fascinating the story became, and the more horrific it became. So about 11 years ago, I did an article in Civil War Times on it. I did a paper for the one of the military history organizations, and this will be a chapter ultimately in my book. But the talk I have tonight has come out of the paper that I did when I presented it a number of years ago. So the talk examines a military expedition by the Union Army of the Potomac's Fifth Corps late in the Civil War. The expedition, officially designated as the Hicksford Raid, took place in December. Its object was the destruction of the railroad link which supplied Lee's Army Northern Virginia, besieged at Petersburg. Unexpectedly, the raid deteriorated into uncontrolled violence and destruction, even though the clear military goals did not include the systematic devastation of civilian property, which had become more common as federal policy toward the end of the war. This convulsion of brutality was unique to the Army of the Potomac and to the annals of the entire Civil War. The talk will scrutinize several important questions. What were the circumstances that led to the situation? What actions occurred and how widespread was the destruction? And finally, why did it happen? Okay, let's see if I can advance this. Come on. For some reason, let me try to get back in and out of here because I am having trouble. There we go. Nope, let's go back. All right, sorry about that, technical difficulties. The commander of the Fifth Corps at the time was Major General Gouverneur K. Warren, a conservative professional soldier. The Corps itself had no previous history of wanton warfare against civilian targets. Even 2 years earlier at Fredericksburg, it had only minimal involvement in the looting of the old colonial city. The Army of the Potomac generally had avoided guerrilla warfare that plagued other Union armies. While Union soldiers often supplemented their rations on the march by foraging at nearby farms for livestock or firewood, it was different from what happened in Sussex County, Virginia, that bitter December of 1864. Some of the Union perspective in this study comes from the soldiers of the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, one of the elite units in the Fifth Corps. Recruited in northwestern Pennsylvania, primarily in Erie County, the 83rd was one of the longest serving units in the Army of the Potomac, participating in every campaign since March of 1862. By the fall of '64, the 83rd was much reduced by combat and expired enlistments. As a result, at the time of the raid, only about 200 men mustered in for combat service out of an authorized complement of 1,000. By the end of the war, the 83rd held the tragic distinction of suffering the second highest number of combat deaths of all federal infantry regiments. And this was its commander at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Chauncey Rogers. After more than 3.5 years of combat, the Civil War was a much different conflict than it had been in the spring of 1861. Gone were the days of idealism, limited warfare, and protection of enemy civilian property rights, including slaves. Attitudes had hardened on both sides. The results of the November '64 re-election of Lincoln showed that voters in the Union firmly rejected the peace platform advocated by the Democrats. Even the Army, which voted in the field for the first time in American history, overwhelmingly rejected the Democratic candidate, its beloved ex-commander, George McClellan. The attitude within the ranks reflected a grim determination to finish the war. The recent overland campaign during May and June had produced the most sustained and costly fighting between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. That campaign was followed immediately by a protracted siege around Petersburg. That city was vital as the key to the Confederate capital of Richmond, 20 miles to the north. 4 out of the 5 railroads serving the region ran through Petersburg. Unable to destroy Lee's army north of Richmond, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant in the Army of the Potomac crossed the James River on the night of June 14th, outflanking Richmond. Grant initiated a series of direct assaults on Petersburg, but failed to capture the city. He then changed his strategy and began a 10-month-long siege of Petersburg, pinning down General Lee and his army in a static defense in the Richmond-Petersburg area. Grant's new strategy was to hold Lee in place while extending his trench lines southwest and later from a point starting directly east of Petersburg. This would ultimately cut all the rails into Petersburg, thus forcing Lee to abandon both that city and Richmond. Grant launched a series of offensives throughout the summer and fall aimed at the rail and road networks. Each gained some ground, but none proved to be decisive. By then, the 5th Corps units had endured 6 months of trench warfare and several major battles around the Cockade City. In December, while the men of the 83rd settled into the newly built winter camp, Union headquarters at City Point, Virginia was tense with activity. General Grant, who was the commander-in-chief of all the federal armies, and his staff were planning and coordinating campaigns on several fronts. Grant was especially concerned about the situation outside Nashville, where Major General George Thomas and his Army of the Cumberland confronted the aggressive Confederate General John Bell Hood and his Army of the Tennessee. Meanwhile, William T. Sherman's army was rapidly approaching the Georgia coast, cutting a 60-mile swath of devastation after leaving Atlanta in flames. At the same time, an amphibious expedition to capture the major port of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was protected by Fort Fisher, was being organized at nearby Fortress Monroe, Virginia, down the James River to the right of the map. With winter nearing, Grant was anxious to deal another blow to Lee. His target was the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, which connected southeastern Virginia with North Carolina. It remained a crucial supply conduit for the Confederate Army around Petersburg and Richmond, even after the Union victory at the Battle of Globe Tavern in August, which cut the railroad near Petersburg. The Confederates had continued to run supplies along the railroad to Stony Creek Station, about 20 miles to the south of Petersburg, and then hauling the rest of the way by wagon along the Point Blank Road. Grant wanted this traffic broken up. With the return of the 6th Corps after the victories in the Shenandoah Valley, Grant could strike the Weldon Railroad without weakening his siege works. His plan was to destroy as much of the railroad as it would no longer be practical for Lee's commissar to run a wagon line to the end of the track. Accordingly, on December 5th, Grant issued orders to Major General George G. Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, which read, You may make immediate preparations to move down the Weldon Railroad for the purpose of effectually destroying it as far south as Hicksford or farther if practical. Hicksford was right on the Virginia-North Carolina line. Send a force of not less than 20,000 infantry, 16 or 20 guns, and all your disposable cavalry. 6 days' rations and 20 rounds of extra ammunition will be enough to carry along. Under a previous understanding with Grant, Meade selected General Warren's 5th Corps to conduct the raid. Warren's force would travel light and fast with few encumbering wagons as possible. Meade's order to Warren, delivered on December 6th, was explicit and detailed. You'll be prepared to move down the Weldon Railroad tomorrow morning at daylight or as soon as thereafter practicable. With the force thereafter mentioned, striking the railroad below Stony Creek and effectually destroying it from that post as far as Hicksford, if possible. The force under your command will be the 5th Corps with Mott's division of 2nd Corps and 2 brigades of cavalry, the latter under Brigadier General David Gregg. The order went on to specify the exact amount of artillery, wagons, ammunition, rations, and animal forage to be carried on the expedition. That same day, Meade wrote his wife about the importance of the upcoming raid. Tomorrow, I send off an expedition under Warren, which I trust will result in something decisive, as we are all anxious to have matters on a more settled basis than they are now before the winter. When the orders reached the soldiers of the 5th Corps, the men of the 83rd Pennsylvania complained furiously about giving up their newly constructed winter quarters. One of the soldiers wrote, "We had built our winter quarters on the Peebles farm in November and hoped that we would be allowed to remain there during the winter. But our hopes were somewhat dashed one evening on receiving orders to be in the readiness to move at an early hour the next morning, as we would probably be relieved by the 6th Corps. Swearing was indulged in freely, as you can well imagine." Reports of the movement had been around since the previous Sunday, when Sergeant Daniel Foote of the 83rd wrote to Julie, his fiance. And what you're going to see with a lot of these slides is, as I'm quoting these guys, I'm going to be putting their pictures up so you can hear their voices and see their pictures. Foote wrote, "Marching orders came tonight, and I do not know how long we may be busy, so I decided to write this evening. The 6th Corps has arrived here. We've received orders that at the morrow, the 6th Corps will take our homes and works by our firesides. I'm very glad that it's a noble, brave Corps that is going to enjoy the fruits of our toil. If it was the 9th Corps, should be tempted to set fire to my shanty." What a life the soldiers lead. 2 hours ago, the men were all enjoying a quiet Sabbath evening, full of expectations, and enjoying many such Sabbaths by their firesides. But now they relieve us. Where are we going? One says we're going to cut our way to Sherman. Others say we're going to Weldon of Wilmington. When Colonel Charles Wainwright, commander of the 5th Corps Artillery, was informed about the upcoming raid, he made the following entry into his journal. "The 6th is to relieve the Corps. It is very hard on our men who just got their huts completed to give them to have to turn over to others and build afresh themselves." Typically, the camp was rife with rumors whenever the troops prepared for a movement. On the 5th, Foote recorded in his diary, "Marching orders. What a hurry in camp. No one knows where we're going. The order merely says, be ready to be relieved tomorrow morning at dawn." A part of the 6th Corps landed today at City Point, direct from the Shenandoah. "I have an idea we're going to go back in reserve, somewhere in the rear of the center of our lines, ready to support any part of the if attacked. But I may be mistaken. Time will tell." The next morning, the soldiers, still not knowing what was coming, moved from their camp toward the rear, holding near Fort Stevens. Foote again, "This morning at daybreak, we're in line with everything ready for the march, having been relieved of our comfortable winter quarters and sent away to find new homes. We marched directly to the rear by the way of the Yellow House and Gurley House, bearing to the right from the latter for 4 miles, where we bivouacked in an open field near the Jerusalem Plank Road. The whole Corps having arrived after dark. We have no orders relative to building a camp, and I think we're going to go somewhere else." That evening, the orders were be ready to march at 6 a.m. 60 rounds of ammunition is made up to the men and rations for 4 days. And we quietly lay down to rest upon Mother Earth with a prayer for God's protection through the coming move. Wainwright, by that time, was better informed for the purpose of the raid. He would write, "We, the 5th Corps, are to be moved tomorrow at daylight. It's a mere raiding expedition for the purpose of destroying the Weldon Railroad as far south from Stony Creek as will prevent me from drawing any supplies from that direction. General Warren will have the command." And then he goes on to explain about Gregg and Mott's divisions. "As speed of movement will be our main reliance for success, I am to take but 4 batteries of 4 guns along." Back to Foote. Reveille sounded at 3 a.m. At 4 o'clock, the strike tents was sounded. At 6 a.m., we were underway, filing south along the Jerusalem Plank Road. Mail came this morning for the last time during the movement and brought me a letter from the dear one in the north, full of kind, cheerful thoughts to cheer me through the coming task. We marched directly south until we were between 10 and 20 miles from Petersburg, when we turned to the right and came to halt along the banks of the Nottoway River, waiting for the pontoon train to come up so as to bridge it. We lay there until 10 o'clock p.m., expecting to move at any moment, when we received orders that we would not march until 2 a.m. It rained almost the whole day, making it slippery marching, but tonight the sky became clear, the stars shone brightly as we wrapped ourselves in our overcoats to lay down to take our 4 hours rest with nothing but the stars to guard us, save he who notices the sparrow fall. I have Foote's diaries as well as letters to both his wife and his parents, copies of some originals of others, and he is a very religious man. Almost in every entry he will talk about God's grace. In contrast to Foote's comments about weather and marching difficulties, others recalled mild weather and a pleasant march at the beginning of the expedition. Brigadier General Regis de Trobriand, formerly of the French Army and now commander of a brigade in Mott's division, wrote, "The weather had become more mild. It was one of those autumn days in which it's a pleasure to march, and the spirit exuberant. We turned our backs on Petersburg, which was not unpleasant to us. We advanced into a country in which the marks of war showed less and less, and which had a charm of novelty to us." There's no record to the length of the marching column, but even with reduced wagons and artillery, Warren's troops traveling along a single road could have stretched well over a dozen miles. So the amount of rain experienced by different commands could easily vary. Wainwright wrote a rather lengthy entry for the 7th and also recalled good weather. And even to that veteran officer, the march was intriguing and almost romantic. The head of the infantry column reached this place at Freeman's Ford about 2 hours before dark. The cavalry had crossed by the ford, and one brigade of infantry found its way over in the same manner. Soon the pontoons got up and they began laying a bridge. It was a canvas boat train, the laying of which, being new to me, interested me much. The frame in which the canvas is stretched is very simple and easily put together. The whole packing, when taken apart, is a very small compass. I was too surprised to see that the weight of these boats would hold and how little water passed into them through the canvas. The bridge was very quickly laid. This is one of the great romances of camp life. He paused there and then would go on to say, this is one of the great romances of camp life. The soft night air, the tall leafless trees under which we bivouacked and which stretched along south side of the river, the wide open plain on the opposite bank, the bridge lighted up by great pitch pine fires. The noise of the men, the horses, mules, all contributed to make a picture that one dreams of. The pontoons mentioned by Wainwright were a new type, canvas over wood frames rather than the heavier, cumbersome wooden boats. The wood frames could be quickly set up, then the canvas stretched across. In about an hour, Major Martin Van Brocklin and his 300-man detachment from the 50th New York Engineers assembled 2 bridges of over 150 each. It took less than half that time to disassemble and pack them off for the next crossing. In all, the Corps marched about 15 miles that day before crossing the Nottoway. Confederate scouts soon observed the movement of nearly 27,000 Union troops. When Lee heard the news, he telegraphed the Confederate Guard units along the railroad, as well as Major General Wade Hampton. He wrote to Hampton, the Guard units were warned to be on alert, and Hampton is ordered to scout the Federal force and find out its route and destination. Characteristically, Lee ordered a counter-striking force under Lieutenant General A.P. Hill to move out from Petersburg to attack the Union raiders. During the previous August, Hill and Hampton had mauled a similar force of the Second Corps at Ream Station along the Weldon Railroad. This is another map, a little clearer because it's in black and white, but you see Petersburg up at the top. the Jerusalem Plank Road, which is the road, the long road to the right, and where the units moved down ultimately toward Hicksford and Belfield, rather, at the Marin River, just north of the North Carolina line. Forward right, this morning at 2 o'clock, attention was sounded, arousing me, and the rain pouring down on me. Again, bag and baggage was hooked and buckled, and on we were plodding through the mud for the river. We crossed the river and reached Sussex Courthouse, a distance of 6 miles at daybreak, where we halted for breakfast. The clouds having broke away, a cup of coffee was down, all are in good spirits again, of course, criticizing the country, criticizing the style of buildings and everything else. But Foote would write that Sussex County is quite pleasantly situated, with a little village surrounded by fertile, level, beautiful farming country and many handsome farmhouses surrounded by clusters of Negro huts, which are to be seen throughout the country. A storehouse full of supplies was discovered here and given to the flames. About 8 a.m., we fell into line and pushed on in a southwest direction. The soil being sandy, the road soon became dry, and we had a pleasant march. Now and then, the division of cavalry ahead of us would get into a little skirmish, but the opposition was very slight. We halted for supper about a mile from the Weldon Railroad, and as the men came in with chicken, turkeys, mutton, and fresh pork, as we had orders to forage, we fell into cooking earnestly as we had marched. 2 hours were thus pleasantly spent when the bugle call sounded, attention again, and forward march. So uncoiling, we reached the Weldon Railroad about 8 p.m. We stacked arms, and the work of destruction was commenced. This too is Foote. He said the road was torn from its base and turned over by means of levers, the ties pried from the rails and piled up crosswise, well mixed with fence rails. Then the iron rails laid across the top and fires set to the piles, thus formed the heat, causing the iron rails to bend nearly double. Thus the work went on till midnight. It was a grand sight to see 40,000 men just at work. Of course, there's half that number, but Foote didn't have a good picture of how many people were actually there. As far as the eye could see, to the rear, the fires burned brightly, giving the sky a bright, warm color. And it needed it, for the air was bitter indeed. At midnight, we filed down to the woods and lay down to rest, having done a long, hard day's work, as men usually do, having marched nearly 20 miles. Some still could not sleep until a cup of coffee had been made and drank, then to bed in dreams of home. So the march between the Nottoway and the railroad had totaled about 18 miles. In the pleasant weather on the 8th, many Union soldiers fully shed their heavy coats and equipment. It's quoted, behind them for miles, the roadside was littered with abandoned overcoats, extra blankets, knapsacks, and similar things. Many of the foot-weary and fatigued infantrymen had lightened their loads. They would live to regret it, because the next day, the weather turned cold and stayed cold the remaining of the expedition. The 83rd lost its first man during the raid on the 8th, probably captured while straggling. By the 12th, Hugh Doherty from Dan Foote's Company C was confined in Richmond's Pemberton prison. Gregg's cavalry was the first to approach the railroad at Jarrett Station, where, mentioned by Foote, the first real skirmishes of the raid took place. The outnumbered Confederate cavalry put up a brief, spirited defense before withdrawing to avoid capture. This is W.W. Jarrett, the local resident, who's the station that was named after her family, later reported that 5 of the enemy were killed and buried at the High Hills churchyard. An officer of the 83rd Pennsylvania reported some additional detail about the destruction on the 8th. And this officer was, in this picture, of course, is Sergeant Major, but he, by this time, was Lieutenant Edward Whittlesley. At sundown, our division, commanded by General Griffin, moved to the railroad and destroyed it as far as Jarrett Station, 10 miles from Stony Creek. At midnight, we were relieved by the 3rd Division, who continued to destroy the track while we bivouacked at Jarrett Station. Wainwright observed the suffering that the war had brought even to this relatively untouched part of Virginia, describing the plight of a 6-person family who lived in a home where he camped that night. Foraging Union soldiers had already killed and eaten the last 2 large hogs on the farm. He wrote, "Everything showed the poverty of the inhabitants, though the house was a large one, and the builder no doubt at the time thought himself pretty well to do in the world. Now the white part of the household are evidently all living in one room. They all had to live on now for the coming winter about 3/4 of a barrel of wheat flour, some dozen barrels of old corn. They have suffered badly from the 3 raids, including this one, through here this past season, by which all their growing crops are destroyed, the whole of their livestock killed. The little grain above mentioned and some 8 or 10 very young pigs running around is all they have left, and no money to buy more." The 9th of December marked a major change in the character of the expedition. While the destruction of the railroad continued, serious combat took place at the railroad bridge over the Marion River at Hicksford, 10 miles south of Jared Station. That evening, a volatile mixture of pillage and retaliation, fueled by confiscated liquor, exploded into a kind of violence never before perpetrated by the soldiers of the 83rd or their 5th Corps comrades. This is from Foote's diary again. "All day today, the work of the destruction went on. At night, we went into camp. About 30 miles of the Weldon Railroad had been completely destroyed. We camped about 5 miles from Belfield. Our advance had engaged a quite warm fight during the day, and report says it captured. Afternoon and evening, the sleet is falling, fast forming ice on our tents. The men, among other forage, has discovered a supply of liquors among the plantations about 5 miles distant. I doubt there being over 200 sober men in the entire brigade. Singing, shouting, fighting was the order of the night. It makes me homesick and tired of soldiering to see all these noble men make brutes of themselves. A little after midnight, I got up for the 3rd time to drive a drunken man away from the fire in front of my tent, when one of my comrades, half intoxicated, got mad at some remarks made by the drunken fellows to me and went in and knocked 3 of them down. Some of them twice apiece, and then they crawled off to bed, leaving us quiet. Our objective is accomplished, and they say in the morning we start for the return, having penetrated 15 miles into rebeldom." This is actually a sketch done by another soldier of the foraging during the Hicksford raid. And its caption was "Chasing Down Dinner." The infantry had mustered about 6:30 a.m. that Friday to begin their destructive work at first light. Gregg's cavalry division, which had burned the bridge across the Nottoway several miles north of Jarrett the previous day, rode south to strike the major railroad bridge at the Marion at Hicksford. A brief skirmish at 3 Creeks, they fired the bridge there and continued the final 6 miles to the Marion. The village of Belfield on the north side, across from Hicksford, the Union soldiers encountered a hodgepodge of Confederate defenders commanded by the talented Hampton. Besides the division of veteran cavalry, which had raced around the Union column to reach Hicksford by daylight, his forces include some garrison infantry quickly summoned from across the North Carolina border, accompanied by several companies of underage junior reserves, plus 9 cannon. Get the idea of what a scratch force is and how deeply the Confederates were having to dig into their manpower. Hampton ordered some of his infantry to dig in on the Belfield side to protect the road and railroad bridges. He planned to check the Union advance there in order to give A.P. Hill's pursuing infantry column time enough to catch up and possibly trap Warren's force. On contact, Gregg attacked with 5 of his regiments in a hail of fire and pushed the Belfield defenders out of their rifle pits. Although the Union troopers were subsequently checked by intense artillery and small arms fire from across the river. The Confederates burned the wagon bridge to inhibit the Yankees' ability to cross the Marion. A heavy exchange of fire continued for some time, killing the commander of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. Later in the day, Warren and Wainwright advanced to assess the situation. Wainwright recorded in his diary, after a small attempt to get down to the railroad, it was given up as likely to cost more life than it was worth. This fire cost Gregg some 20 or 30 men. Warren reluctantly concluded that another day's delay to take the crossing and destroy the bridge would jeopardize the safety of his entire expedition. Oh, I'm sorry, I was a slide behind, but that just tells the story. If you look at the bottom of this map, you can see where the two forces came together at Belfield and Hicksford. Meanwhile, the infantry continued their work tearing up and burning the railroad to the north. As each division finished its destruction along their part of the line, they would leapfrog the next division moving south and commence the work again on a fresh section. The men were generally satisfied with their handiwork. The 83rd PA's Ed Whittlesley wrote home, "It was a fine sight to see the line of fire for 10 miles. By late afternoon, the soldiers neared exhaustion from their hard marches and exertions to destroy the railroad. The weather then began to turn miserable, with falling temperatures and heavy rain turning into sleet. When the men broke for camp that evening, they sent out parties for forage to the nearby farms for livestock. Notwithstanding Wainwright's earlier comments, the troops found this section of southeastern Sussex County rich with provisions. At the same time, slaves from the area began to flock to the Union camps seeking freedom. Whittlesley's observation for that evening was fairly typical. At night, we bivouacked on the plantation of one Ben Bayless, who had a lot of Negroes, poultry, grain, etc., which were all appropriated. He had about 20 barrels of liquor called Applejack. Our men got a hold of it, and many of them were soon drunk. Applejack is a very potent type of apple brandy, also called Applejack whiskey. That night, the normally disciplined troops of the 5th and 2nd Corps turned into a drunken, unruly mob as more units discovered that Applejack was produced and stored in large quantities throughout that area. Some depredations against civilians had actually started even before the whiskey was found. In a letter home, Colonel Robert McAllister of Mott's division mentioned the burning of the homestead of a Reverend Bailey, an unrepentant successionist who had a large plantation with cotton stores. This occurred in the march to the railroad. Another 2nd Corps writer reported that no special order having been given against pillaging and the destruction of private property, there was from the first march straggling for those purposes. On the 2nd and 3rd day, this was carried to a shameful extent, every house within sight and far some beyond being visited. Although the troops are amply supplied with food, houses were ransacked and stripped of everything edible, while women and children wept in their protestation. The whiskey-fed breakdown in discipline spread this behavior and set off the tragic chain of events. Numerous regimental, let me get quick water here. Numerous regimental histories, diaries, and letters recount the consumption and the effects of Applejack. Amos Judson, in his history of the 83rd, wrote, "Almost every man in the brigade filled his canteen and coffee pot, and by midnight we had a drunken brigade. Things quickly got out of hand. The disorder reached such an extent that a regiment of cavalry was sent in to suppress it, but the cavalrymen too were overcome and only added to the uproar." The plunder of the surrounding homestead intensified, and several rapes even occurred. Color was no barrier. Both black and white women were victimized, including one in advanced pregnancy. Another letter, one soldier even pointed out a Union officer accused of crime. During the night, Colonel Edwin R. Biles of the 99th Pennsylvanian and his adjutant were perpetrating one of the foulest outrages upon two defenseless women whose house was within our lines. These women were compelled to submit to their infamous proposals or have their house burned down and themselves turned out into the bleak December. Had this been a work of privates, the said privates would have suffered death. But old Biles is an officer and was drunk, as is his custom. The escalating pillage reverberated throughout the night. Reacting to the Yankee depredations, a number of locals, as well as roving bands of Confederate cavalry, began to retaliate. Some Union stragglers who were caught were summarily executed. Meanwhile, the scouts for Major General Matthew Butler's cavalry of Wade Hampton's command were instructed, quote, that when they caught Yankees in the act of robbing and burning, to take the vandals by the arms and legs and swing them into the flames, drunk or sober. Such are the terrors of war. By morning, most of the army was in no shape to march, but necessity forced Warren to push the troops. A.P. Hill's corps is rapidly approaching. Had Hill moved aggressively to cut across Sussex Courthouse at Jarrett Station, instead of swinging south through Hicksford, the expedition would have been in serious trouble. Hill here missed a golden opportunity. Foote's short diary entrance for the day recounted what happened next. December 10th, Saturday. March to Sussex Courthouse, distance of 21 miles. This morning we started on the back track. It proved a hard day's march to me, being ordered to stay and get all the drunken fellows of the night before started. After an hour of task was accomplished and I had to make up what the column had the start of me. We took a new road, reaching Sussex Courthouse a little after dark, where we went into camp. Some of our stragglers had been found with their throats cut, their bodies stripped. Orders were given to burn everything. Our path is marked by fire and smoke. Caught in this spasm of violence were two members of the 83rd, both too drunk to march out of camp. James Flynn, a native of Ireland who had been in the regiment less than a year, was captured. He was sent to Pemberton prison and paroled in March of 1865. A man of good health, Flynn was mentally broken by his imprisonment. And quoting from his pension record, he became insane by reason of said service in Company A of the 83rd Pennsylvania and being a volunteer in Pemberton prison. He suffered mental problems for the rest of his life and was confined to insane asylums from 1870 all the way to his death in 1903. Another man lost was German immigrant Louis Schilling, also of Company A, who enlisted the previous February. He disappeared and was never heard from again. As he was his mother's sole supporter, she applied for a survivor's pension after the war. An affidavit written to support her claim stated that the 83rd was retreating from the enemy. The said Louis Schilling being from some cause, and this next part of the quote was actually added, in the line of duty, unable to march and abandoned in the field. I saw him thus abandoned and have not heard from him since. The enemy at this time was heavily pressing our rear, and their firing could be distinctly heard at the time the said Louis Schilling was left behind and abandoned. Another affidavit read, he was unable to stand upon his feet or walk, and so he was abandoned. Hardly then in the line of duty. No prisoner of war record for Schilling exists. He certainly died at the hands of the pursuing Confederate cavalry. Private George McKee of Company C was also captured on the 10th. His service record gives no indication regarding the circumstances of his capture, except it was this side of Belleville, and these were the last documented casualties from the 83rd. Other units suffered much more. Many other Union soldiers separated from their commands and most likely drunk were ambushed. Quote, they killed them, then mutilated their bodies. The dead were stripped naked, their throats slashed from ear to ear, and were hung along the side of the road where the returning column could see them. At Sussex Courthouse, the bodies of a half dozen nude Union soldiers were found, placed side by side in front of the courthouse. A murdered Union soldier was discovered pinned to the ground by a stake driven through his mouth. Enraged, the Union soldiers escalated their violence. It's unclear if any orders were given to burn civilian homes. Warren, in his official report indicated that he tried to stop it, as did several other officers. In all probabilities, these acts were spontaneous. While some officers were participating, others were looking the other way. Many accounts mention the body at the courthouse, but comparatively few claim to have actually seen them. The numbers cited range from 2 to 6 laid out. Nevertheless, the news of this discovery spread like wildfire through the line of march, and the command became a destroying host as it moved back northward. This is far from the typical type of warfare for these Union soldiers. There's a more callous violence against civilians and their property. I'm going to quote a couple of other letters from other units. Soldiers' own words: after witnessing the human acts of the inhabitants, we fired every building on the route. Some innocent persons undoubtedly suffered, but it is one of the inevitable consequences of war. It's a sad sight to see houses burned over women and children, but provocation seemed to justify the act. There's no way of discriminating between the innocent and the guilty. Next, the bodies of 8 to 10 of our men have been recovered assassinated, and it was from that time everything in our pass was consumed by flames. One soldier from Michigan wrote, "May God forbid that the enemy making a like march through Michigan or any other northern state. We burnt the houses over people's heads and destroyed everything that came in our way. It looked hard to see women crying, no shelter from the storm. But then again, on the other hand, the men had shot some of our men and cut their throats and otherwise mutilated them." Another, in retaliation for our men, on our return, we burnt almost every house on the road. This is a hard sight. Not all Union officers were so sure of the justification. The chaplain of the 120th New York expressed his revulsion. Such savage atrocity, the murder of the Union stragglers, cannot be too severely punished. But wholesale and terrible retaliation, for the most part, on the innocent and helpless for acts as wicked as they were incited by the wanton outrages of our own men. It could not be but a bad lesson for the morals of the troops. Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain, who commanded a brigade in Griffin's division during the raid, also expressed his frustrations over the events of the 10th. This was a very hard sight. I saw sad work in protecting helpless women and children from outrage. I invariably gave them protection, which every man of honor will give any woman as long as she is a woman. But I have no doubt they were all burned out before the whole army got by. It was a sad business. And this is a very interesting quote that he makes here. I am willing to fight men in arms, but not babes in arms. Wainwright composed another long entry for the 10th, praising his own artillerymen for the discipline during the march. But he said that although there is great provocation against the Union soldiers, it is not enough to justify their acts at all. He wrote, "None escaped, large and small. Pigsties and privies were all burnt. Barely time allowed for the people themselves to get out, saving nothing. The Negroes fared no better than the whites. For this barbarism, there's no real excuse except exasperation, innate depravity of mankind is one. So pitiable a sight as women and children turned adrift at nightfall, a most severe night too. I never saw before and never want to see again. If this is a raid, deliver me from going on another." The miserable weather made the return march even more difficult. General de Trobriand wrote in a letter home on the 14th describing the conditions. During the night between 9 and 10, the snow changed to ice, and all during the following day we marched on ice in a frozen landscape. I never saw anything like that. There wasn't a blade of grass, nor a leaf, nor a branch which wasn't covered by a quarter inch of ice. It's a curious, magnificent sight to see, but hellishly cold. As the day warmed slightly, the troops found themselves marching in icy, ankle-deep mud. When Warren arrived at the courthouse, he ordered a stop to the burning. He later mentioned only one instance of a soldier with his throat cut, but acknowledged that it soon became the belief of all men in the command. Every effort was made by the officers to stop the fires, which he says most likely punished only the innocent, but with only partial success. The Confederate victims long recounted the humiliation by the Federal troops who burned their furniture, homes, and crops and left women and children in the snow with no food or animals. It was finally the darkness, the heavy cold rain, and exhaustion that ended the burnings. Back at City Point, a nervous Grant was very concerned about the safety of the expedition from the outset. In the early afternoon of the 7th, he sent inquiries to Meade, and on the 10th, the Union commander occupying the area of Suffolk, Virginia, for information on Warren's status. That same day, he requested that Meade move all the force you can to Warren's relief. I don't think there should be any delay in sending reinforcements. Later that afternoon, Meade ordered General Potter's 9th Corps Division south towards Sussex in an attempt to find and perhaps rescue Warren. On the 11th, Warren's troops made another physically difficult march back toward the safety of the Petersburg lines. The Confederates under Hill never caught up, and Hampton's cavalry broke off harassing the rear guard before the Union men recrossed the Nottoway. Foote would write, "The courthouse and village were burned this morning. We recrossed the Nottoway and marched about a mile towards Petersburg on the Jerusalem Plank Road and bivouacked in Pine Woods." General Joseph Bartlett, who was the 83rd Brigade commander, and staff rode around quite a flock of sheep and drove them into our brigade and called on us to rally around the sheep boys. Within 5 minutes, none were left for others, and we had plenty of mutton. We met a division of the 9th Corps that was sent to help us out of our mess that we might have gotten into, but Warren sent them right back to their camp. It's unclear how much damage was actually done to the civilian property. By some accounts, it appears that maybe hundreds of homes were destroyed. Many of the soldiers on the march certainly believe so. But however, the Sussex County Land Book records for 1865 show only 28 homes with lower assessments due to damage from the raid. This is very close to the figure given by Detroit Briand in his December 14th letter. We have burned about 30 plantations and taverns, besides barns and forage in retaliation for our stragglers who were murdered. Although Foote and many others believe that the courthouse was burned, the original mid-19th century structure still stands. A few beams in the attic are charred, but bloodstains from Union soldiers hospitalized can still be seen on the second story. The floorboards there. About 12 years ago, when I visited the courthouse, the county clerk, Gary Williams, stated that while many of the records were burned, the majority were hidden away before Gregg's cavalry swept through on the 8th. 2 record books left behind and not destroyed are still in the courthouse today. One was cut almost in half by a Union saber slash. The other has graffiti written on it by a Union officer. And I'll quote this. "This indenture was made on the 11th day of December, 1864, in the county of Sussex, Virginia. Know ye all people, this is the case that there is to be one more vigorous and well-directed blow against the existing rebellion while she is struggling in the last throes of expiring agony." And then he wrote, "Oh fiddlesticks." And he said, signed by the commanding officers of the Cavalry Corps. It's quite a thing to see that. Another relic of the ransacked courthouse is the original solid silver county seal, which is about this big. And the seal was created in 1804. It disappeared during the raid, not unsurprisingly, but was mailed back to the county in 1901 by the former commissary sergeant of the 40th New York, who in his letter said he accidentally acquired it. The seal and the letter are now framed in the clerk's office. Foote would write another letter from home about the severe night, about marching back, receiving the mail and hearing the news, and resting. The last 6 days, we have marched over 100 miles and destroyed a large amount of property. We fail to thank God for our success and our safe return. Other letters written by members of the 83rd after the return praised the success of the raid, but made little or no mention of the burning of the civilian homes. The chaplain, O.B. Clark, who didn't go on the expedition, would write to his son, again, praising the expedition. As you've doubtless heard before this, the late raid was a complete success. Our boys found a superabundance of applejack, that is, apple whiskey. Some few stragglers were gobbled up and killed by guerrillas. Several were found belonging to this corps with their throats cut, but only 36 straggled from the 1st Division, including the missing. They tore up 10 miles of railroad and a bridge across the Nottoway River, 2 grist mills, a number of houses in retaliation. They got back so much for the late. Newspaper accounts were published in Erie, again, just talking about the success of the raid. The regimental historian talked nothing about the dead stragglers and simply said, "We did not fire a shot while we were gone, except at hogs and sheep." In the aftermath, soon after the expedition, several circulars were from various headquarters were issued, noting the success of the raid and singling out specific units and individuals for commendation. Only Warren's official report mentioned killings of the stragglers or the burnings of civilian homes. All other official reports were silent on the subject. There's a far different reaction from 2 earlier situations when Union combat units pillaged and burned civilian homes on a large scale. After Athens, Alabama was sacked, the commanding colonel there was court-martialed. After Fredericksburg was sacked, the officers took the plunder away from the soldiers that carried it away. But by the end of 1864, there was virtually no public comment in the North, and no disciplinary actions were taken against the offending soldiers for the unauthorized depredations against the civilians in Sussex courthouse. After the return, the men of the 83rd quickly slipped back into their familiar routines. Their most immediate concern was building new shelters, and that is all detailed in some more of Foote's diary. The destruction of the railroad severely damaged the brittle system that supplied Lee's army. Throughout the winter, thousands of Confederates deserted to Union lines with tales of little food and inadequate clothing. Thousands of others simply slipped away, returning to their homes. The Weldon had been the Army's principal source of animal fodder for the cavalry, so the cavalry and the artillery suffered especially. Days after the raid, the Confederates started repairs on the destroyed tracks. General Hampton placed Butler in charge of the work with 1,000 of his cavalrymen. He rebuilt about 6 miles of lines within 2 weeks. Then the railroad superintendent impressed about 300 slaves to continue the work. But it wasn't until early March that the rail was opened all the way back to Stony Creek. But it was only in operation for a few days before the events of Petersburg led to the abandonment of the whole line. Casualties on both sides are relatively minor compared to the statistics often associated with other large-scale operations. Union losses were not specifically reported for the raid itself, but only for the entire month. Since none of the raiding units were heavily engaged in December, the casualties can be reasonably estimated at 200 infantry and 130 cavalry, including about 225 missing. The Confederate losses went unreported. Now, I still have a little bit more to go, but I see that we are at 8:30. Tell me if I have a section on causation, on the effects of soldiers in these sort of situations. I could go into that, or I could just simply wrap up at this point. It's up to you guys how long you want to stay on.
Okay, guys, what do you think? You want to just call it quits for now?
I'd vote to drive on. This is fascinating.
I've had enough.
Okay, well, we,
Well, let me wrap up real briefly here. By saying that although it's unique and underreported, the story of the Hicksford Raid is still significant. It demonstrates how ordinary soldiers with no previous history of violent behavior against non-combatants, when confronted with extraordinary circumstances in enemy territory, can lose their discipline and resort to barbarism. During the raid, a mixture of alcohol, enemy retaliation, and rumor turned a 20,000 plus armed unit into a dangerous rabble. It's surprising that more violence and damage did not occur. Warren and his subordinate commanders deserve much credit for being able to keep the expedition together and march it out of Sussex County as effectively as they did after the events of December 9th and 10th. So that concludes, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
yeah, why don't we just do this? If you have a question, unmute yourself and ask the question, and we'll do this for a little bit, see if we get some answers here going. Go ahead. If anybody has any questions.
I have a question for you, George. This is Steve Smith. About the same time this was happening, we had Sherman's March to the Sea. You say this was a kind of an exceptional raid, but is it part of a larger phenomenon of at this point the war had gone so long, and people were just so fed up that it became kind of a 20th century war as it came to a conclusion?
One of the pieces that I did not go into was specifically about the discussion on how a rather well-known European historian talks about the transition from the limited war of the 18th centuries in Europe to the total war of the 20th century, and pins the Civil War as the lynch point between that. He called that the Americans were used to fighting primary warfare, and that the American Civil War set that stage. Now, to answer your question about Sherman, there is a difference between what Sherman did and what happened in Sussex County. Sherman's troops were under specific orders to destroy anything that was useful to the Confederates. There were some burnings and some lootings by those outside the what would you consider the command of Sherman. So there were deprivations, but nothing, there weren't tens of thousands of men out of control with what they were doing. This was not intended to be a raid against civilians. The rapes, the burnings of homes, from farmhouses to mansions to, as they put it, Negro huts, they just burned everything in their path. It was a vengeful, out of control mob, basically. And even though, again, some of Sherman's bummers were certainly outside the rules that even Sherman had set, it wasn't, in the big picture, I suppose you can draw an analogy, but the actions were certainly different.
How did you come across Foot's diary?
The diaries are actually at the War College in Carlisle. I originally came across, as I was researching for the book that I continue to work on, the letters to Foot's parents are here in the Erie County Historical Society. And then I started to dig, and the War College is always someplace I've consulted, and then found his diaries and the letters to his fiancee Julie there. And it's really fascinating when you look at the body of what we have in Erie and the body of what are at the War College, because Julie eventually donated the diaries and the letters to the War College, while his parents gave the letters to the Historical Society up here. He will talk about different things to his parents that he won't to Julie, and vice versa. It's really kind of a fascinating thing. But Foote is a prolific writer and diarist, and a very solid Christian man. I quote him extensively through the book, and when it comes out, I'll make sure you guys know it's going to be published. But
Yes,
so
please do.
yeah, and I found a set of diaries in Florida on the 83rd. I have found, besides, we have a great deal of stuff here in Erie. I found his stuff all over the place.
Hey, George, well done. I always enjoy your programs.
Thank you.
I have been all over that area on a job I had doing commercial agriculture about 25 years ago. The Meharan Valley is known as peanut country between Virginia and North Carolina. I'm frankly amazed how Warren was able to get 27,000 people down through that country and across those rivers. Every one of those river crossings would be a major activity. I mean, you got to give credit to the people with the pontoons and the engineering people. Of course, Warren was an engineering officer, but the logistical part of it, I would be very interested how you cover that in your story, because that isn't that easy. And then the fact that they were living off the land, their retreat sounded a little bit like Napoleon leaving Moscow, but the weather can get nasty down there. They don't have a lot of snow, but they have a lot of ice. And that cold weather in December and January goes right into your bones. So I can imagine how tough it was for those soldiers. And even the guys from Erie that are used to winter, it's a different kind of cold down there.
Yeah, again, I did not do several of the letters just because of time, but they do speak of how bitter it was trying to get out of there.
This is Don Madar. I have a question in terms of on the heels of the Chambersburg burning, coming into Pennsylvania with that, having an 83rd PA, Erie, do you think there might have been a little bit of retribution or payback for having Chambersburg having been on the heels of the Virginia incident?
I saw no evidence, not only out of the 83rd guys, but there's Fifth Corps had a lot of Pennsylvania units in it. And every source that I could find, nobody mentioned Petersburg. Of course, I mentioned Chambersburg rather. The Chambersburg raid was avenged by Hunter in Lexington and so on in the valley. But nobody mentioned that. As a matter of fact, again, except for those couple of mentions of some lootings and whatnot going on by the Second Corps troops on the way in, it wasn't until really the whiskey that fueled this. And then the deprivations got worse. The retaliations from the Southerners began, and it created that vicious cycle.
Where was Sheridan at this point? Like he took place with Hunter, right? Was he around Greg at all?
He had just returned no, actually, I don't think he was back yet. He was marching his cavalry overland while the Sixth Corps basically came in. They had gotten boats on the Potomac and had sailed down to City Point. I believe the cavalry was marching overland. I don't think Sheridan was back quite yet. But Greg exercised independent command. He was one of the two cavalry divisions that belonged to the Army of the Potomac, while Sheridan's command, by that time, had become the Army of the Shenandoah. Also, the 19th Corps had been left behind in the DC area, but by Early was so badly beaten at that point, there wasn't a threat anymore. So, but it was indeed the 6th Corps, I believe, got there well before Sheridan did.
Thank you. Very enjoyable presentation.
You're welcome. I always enjoy doing these.
Hey, George,
other-
Steve Smith here again. As a retired Army judge advocate, I can't help but think of this in conventional terms. And I'm wondering, did anybody get court-martialed for
Absolutely not.
crimes
There-
against humanity or violating the primitive laws of war at the time?
No, and some of this violated the Liebler Code that was in place. But no, there was absolutely no, except for Warren, there's no mention of it in any of the OR. So that's why I was surprised when I stumbled across it a number of years ago, because I read about Petersburg, but I think my research on this predated a couple of the books out on Petersburg now, but even I think maybe only Trudeau will mention it. It's just, I guess it doesn't rise in the OR to the point where you've got a lot of reports, so people don't know about it. But no court-martials, no recriminations.
Okay, any other questions for anybody? If not, before we go, George, I want to thank you very much. Like I said, it's very interesting that, like I say, I think a lot of times we find out these little known facts are just as interesting as the big historical facts. And like I say, they might not have fought in the big battles, but if somebody starts shooting at you, it's a big battle to you. Next month, we're going to have Bob O'Connor. It's called The Perfect Steel Trap of Harper's Ferry. And this gentleman has written a couple of books by, he's the main character is a guy named Gatesby, and he's actually the blacksmith and slave to Lewis Washington, which is a great grandnephew of George Washington. And it goes on with 24 eyewitnesses that dealt with the retaliation and what went on during the John Brown's raid. So I think that's be pretty interesting. And just a quick one, Steve, and I know Steve just talks real quick and short, just a quick blurb of your meeting tomorrow night.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. Tomorrow night at 6:45, if you'd like to join the Harrisburg Civil War Roundtable's January engagement on Zoom, Ricky's already sent the link around. Thank you for helping us get the word out. We have Dr. Matthew Pinsker from Dickinson College, and the topic is slave stampedes and wartime emancipation. Should be very interesting. Dr. Pinsker heads the House Divided project at Dickinson College, whose most recent graduate is Cooper Wingert, a member of our roundtable who's now studying at Georgetown, to bring it full circle for George.
By the way, Bob O'Connor is a friend of mine. He always gives a good talk if you haven't heard him before.
Okay, good. Yeah, he's a new one to our group, which would be great, fantastic. Okay, so that's it. Again, George, thank you very much. It's very interesting. Maybe me and Joe have to take a little sneak back down to North Carolina, Virginia territory, and
There you go.
go through that.
Well, I definitely suggest stop at the Sussex County Courthouse. I don't know if Gary Clark is still there after a dozen years, but the seal and the letter, and if you get somebody to take you upstairs, you can see the charred attic, and you can see on the floorboards on the second floor the bloodstains from the Union soldiers. It's quite poignant, actually.
Oh yeah, and interesting. Okay, if that's all. Again, well, thank you, George. Again, great talk, and we'll see everybody tomorrow with Steve and his gang. And not, we'll see everybody this time next month with Bob O'Connor.
Be sure
Guys,
to keep me on your mailing list, Ricky.
Oh, I've definitely got you on that. I say, everybody stay safe. I'd say, stay out of trouble. We know that'll never work. So just stay safe and healthy and see you guys next month.
Thanks,
Take care,
George.
guys.
Take
Right
care.
on.